There are some sins that we read about in Scripture that a lot of people really struggle with. There's some sins that we read about in our New Testament or even just passages that we really struggle with our Christian living. You know, we come across topics like patience and we think, I really struggle with patience. You know, that's something that I need to work on my patience. I need to get better in patience. We think about things like the pursuit of holiness. I need more holiness in my life, and I'm just not pursuing it as I should. Things like studying God's word more, or just loving our neighbor. These are things that we read about in Scripture that a lot of us can struggle with in our daily lives. Or maybe some of us have sins in our lives that we really struggle with. Things like addiction or substance abuse or things like that we're really trying to get better at, but we're struggling with those sins. Of all the sins that we could look at in Scripture and all the sins that we think about that we might struggle with, we do come across some that is like, we think to ourselves, that's really not a problem for me. I really don't necessarily need to hear lessons on certain things because, it doesn't bother me too much. It's not something that I struggle with. It's not something that I face. We could look around laws in the Bible around things like the treatment of slaves. And we say that I'm okay on that. I don't treat my slaves poorly. I don't have slaves, so I don't need to worry about that sort of lesson. Or, if we're people who don't struggle with substance addiction or substance abuse, we look at commands around alcohol and say, that's easy. That's not a problem for me. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 to 30, Jesus begins teaching on the law with two commands that people need to obey. The commands of murder and adultery. These are sins that's not really something you just stumble into. I hope as I stand here before this congregation, murder is not something that we think, I really struggle with that. I wish I could just stop murdering. There are some commands that are not like that. Particularly in the ancient world. Murder is something that's, it's not something that just, murder is not something that people stumble into. Adultery, especially in the ancient world, is something that people generally wouldn't do, because in the Old Testament there was a death penalty associated with adultery. So people would say it's just not worth it. I'm not going to engage in that in the ancient world. So as Jesus comes in Matthew chapter 5 verse 21, he says, I'm going to tell you about murder and I'm going to tell you about adultery. People think, I'm good on those ones. I've ticked that box. I don't need to worry about those things. And to be fair to those listeners of Jesus' sermon, if they were to hear any average first century sermon on murder or an average first century sermon on adultery, they'd be like, yeah, I'm good. I'm okay on this. I've ticked that box. You'd hear that sermon and you'd leave feeling pretty good about yourself. I'm justified. I don't have those issues. I don't sin in that way. But as Jesus preaches on these commands, as Jesus brings the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, the first two things I'm going to teach you are about murder and adultery. He brings it home for everyone. He says that these commands are things that you need to think about in your life. These are commands that are relevant to you. And not just to everyone in the hearing of the Sermon on the Mount, but everyone thereafter. Everyone for all of Christian history can look to the Sermon on the Mount and hear a sermon on murder and adultery and find that this is actually relevant to me. This is relevant to everyone. What I want to do this morning is I want to look at this passage in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 to 30. And I want to look at it in the same kind of formula that Jesus does, the way Jesus presents this over the next, 3 weeks. We're going to look through these topics that Jesus preaches through in the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to use that formula. We're going to, basically what Jesus does, he says, I'm going to talk about murder. What he does is he says, I'm going to tell you about what the law says. I'm going to give you the law. And then included with that, we're also going to look at the Pharisaic or the common interpretation of the law at that time. The common interpretation of the law in Jesus' day. And then we're going to look at the fullness of the law. Sorry, that's not it. The fullness of the law as well. And that is Jesus bringing the fulfillment of the law. Jesus interpreting the law properly, showing the intention and the heart of the law. So to get into the text then, let's look initially at verse 21, where Jesus begins his discussion on murder. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21 says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court.'" The Old Testament law that we read about in Exodus chapter 20 is, "You shall not murder," or "Thou shalt not murder." For some reason, the Ten Commandments is one of those passages that stays in your head in King James Version. It has to be "Thou shalt." That and Psalm 20, Psalm 23, always got to be in the King James Version. This command, this "Thou shalt not kill" or "Thou shalt not murder," is not dealing with, in the sense, just killing. It's not just talking about killing. It's talking specifically about murder. That is the unjust or the passionate taking of another person's life. What is not included in this law is it's not talking about killing in self-defense or in war or in corporate execution, mandated execution. And we could look throughout the Old Testament and see countless examples of God specifically mandating those sorts of things. Now, of course, we understand that the command not to murder is not dealing with these things. It's not dealing with self-defense or war or mandated execution. The law itself is just condemning unjust or passionate taking of another person's life. In our Wednesday night class, we've looked at Moses and how when he decided to make himself a judge over the Israelite people, before he was made by God to be a judge over the Israelite people, he took an Egyptian's life. He took it unjustly. He took that life out of passion. That's murder. But when Moses did that as a judge of Israel, where he took people's life outside of that, as the judges of Israel took people's life in corporate execution, that is justified. That is just, and is not a violation of the law not to murder. So that's what the initial law was. But Jesus gives this common interpretation of the law as well. He says, "You shall not commit murder," and then he gives this common interpretation of the time. "Whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." This is how the Pharisees understood the law. Jesus gives this Pharisaic interpretation of the law, and we need to understand as we look at that Pharisaic interpretation, it's not actually wrong. It is in fact true that if you commit murder, you're liable to the court. We look in the Old Testament scriptures in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 12, where it says that those who murder are subject to the death penalty. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 18, we read about the appointment of judges and how that there was supposed to be rules and courts that would determine the guilt of people who were brought forward under murder. So it's not as though the interpretation that the Pharisees had of murder was wrong. What Jesus is not necessarily correcting the Pharisaic interpretation. Rather, what he's doing by providing this interpretation is he's exposing the Pharisaic mindset around the law. He's exposing the way the Pharisees think about the law. So the Pharisees believed that the problem with committing murder is that there is a punishment associated with it. Right? You don't want to commit murder because if you commit murder, then you're liable to judgment. You're liable to the court. There's going to be a physical consequence to you committing murder. So don't do it. Basically, according to the Pharisaic interpretation, we shouldn't commit murder because what goes around comes around. Because we might actually face a consequence if we do that. So Jesus responds then. He gives the law itself, he gives the Pharisaic interpretation of the law, and then he continues to give the fullness of the law, the correct interpretation of the law. He says in verse 22, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." Jesus says, don't even be angry with your brother. If you have the King James Version or the New King James Version, you'll read there, it says, do not be angry with your brother without a cause. It's not just dealing with any kind of anger here, because we need to understand there is such a thing as just anger. We read about in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, where Paul, dealing with this very same concept, he says, be angry and do not sin. You can be angry and not sin. There is a place for anger. We even see instances like Mark chapter 3 and verse 5, when Jesus is healing a man on the Sabbath day. He looked around at the Pharisees who were standing around him, just waiting for him to mess up. And it says there that he looked at them in anger. He was angry with them, and then he healed the man on the Sabbath. There are occasions in which we should be angry. There are occasions in which anger is appropriate. Martin Luther described this as an anger of love, one that wishes no one any evil, one that is friendly to the person but hostile to the sin. Yes, anger is okay, but what Jesus is dealing with in this passage is an anger with sinful intent. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation where you've just thought to yourself, even just that for a moment, if I had a baseball bat, or if I had a cricket bat, or if I was in a certain situation, and maybe we think, I wouldn't actually act on it. I wouldn't do that. But that thought comes into your mind of, I wish I could enact violence on this person. I wish I could do something to this person. Jesus' interpretation of this law is that if you have the desire to do someone harm, even if you think to yourself, I'd never actually do it, but if you had the desire to do it, then it's as though you've already committed the sin. It's as though you've already done it. Jesus uses the same formula as the Pharisees in their interpretation. When in verse 21, he says, whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But then in verse 22, he says, I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, or shall be liable before the court. It's the same word is being used there. He goes on, he's not just guilty before the court, but guilty before the Supreme Court, guilty before the Sanhedrin, guilty enough to go into hell. I remember as a kid being scared to death by these verses. If you insult your brother, you're guilty enough to go into hell, into the fiery hell. I grew up with two siblings, and I called them all sorts of names, far worse than things like you fool or you good for nothing. Right? If you grew up with siblings, you're calling them names. You're being nasty to one another. That's part of growing up with siblings. But I remember when I saw this verse, I was worried that as though what Jesus is saying here is this is the unforgivable sin. If you've called your brother a fool, then you are going to the fiery hell. Now, to be fair to my younger self, it is true that any sin, including words spoken out of sinful anger, is a sin that separates us from God. That is absolutely true. But Jesus' point in this passage is not that we should be condemning people to hell if they say a nasty word to someone. Or even less than that we should be taking one another to court if we say nasty words to each other. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. That's not the point that Jesus is making. He's using a bit of hyperbole here. He's using these extreme consequences to show the foolishness of the Pharisees' false interpretation. He's saying that's not why you don't commit murder. The reason you don't commit murder is not just because you're going to go to court for it. Because I say to you, even if you use a bad name to someone, if you call someone the Greek word here is moros, which is where we get our word moron from. If you call your brother a moron, you're guilty enough to go into hell. He's saying that's not the reason you don't do it. What he's using this hyperbole, using these extreme consequences to show it should not be the consequences that deter you from law breaking, but a guilty heart towards God. Having a guilty heart towards God, that's what should deter you. The fact that you've offended God should be enough to stop you from sinning. Jesus provides a specific application From verse 23 and following, verse 23 down to 26. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember you have a brother who has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar, and go first, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. Jesus uses this as a specific application. He kind of provides this illustration of a person who is coming to worship God, and he's in the middle of his worship. He's there at the altar presenting his offering, and he remembers, someone has something against me. I'm not reconciled to my brother. And Jesus uses his example as, one that would be lost on the religious teachers of Jesus' day. They wouldn't understand this. Because you see, the understanding of the religious leaders, the understanding of the Pharisees was ritual worship is of prime importance. That's the most important thing. Ritual worship. That comes before anything else. But Jesus says that reconciliation is so important that it comes in priority to ritual worship of God. If there is bad blood between brethren, that needs to come first. That needs to be fixed. That needs to be remedied. And then you come and present your offering to the altar. It's this, how can we come before a holy God when we have unresolved sin between our brethren? How can we come before God in worship when we have unresolved sin, unresolved issues between brethren? Instead, he says, be reconciled between yourselves. He says in the last part of that, make friends quickly with your opponent at law. Sort things out before things escalate to court. Before even you think about consequences, think about reconciliation. Think about making things right. Think about, how can I fix this relationship? In this instance, he says, even if you have guilt in the heart and even if you are liable to the court, choose instead to be reconciled. Choose instead to fix that relationship. I think we can easily fall into the trap of treating sin like the Pharisees do. I think we can very easily fall into that trap. I recall growing up hearing a lot of preaching on avoiding sin because of the physical consequences. Saying, make sure you don't mess around before you're married, because if you do, you'll contract diseases and die. Or if you do, even if you survive, no one will ever want to marry you because you've been defiled. That's the reason we don't mess around before marriage, because of the physical consequences. Don't get tattoos because you'll get a disease from the needle and die. But if you do somehow survive, you'll never get a job because you'll be covered in tattoos. If you drink alcohol, you'll kill your brain cells, you'll die, you'll become addicted or die in a car crash or something like that. And it's always this preaching around there are physical consequences. So that's why we don't do those things. That's why we as Christians avoid these things, because there's consequences to it. We do the same with drugs, homosexuality, pornography, adultery, any other topical lesson we can think of. Physical consequences are not the problem with sin. And I don't want to deny that there are physical consequences. I don't want to deny that those things do exist. And that one of the reasons that God gives us these commands and these things to avoid is because they're not good for us. But the prime concern of sin, the prime problem of sin, is that we are displeasing to God, that we are bringing a guilty heart before God, that it's about what happens on the inside and not just the external application of that. We have anger as a huge problem in the world today. We live in a culture where being angry and offended is seen as a virtue and often to be praised. The angrier you are, or the more offended you are, then the more justified or vindicated you ought to be. The more you ought to be praised. And we see this manifesting itself in all sorts of terrible things said about other people. And I think it's made even worse with the anonymity of the internet. When you just look at a YouTube comment section Doesn't matter what the video is, look at the YouTube comment section and you are going to see all sorts of vitriol and all sorts of vile names being said, all sorts of nasty comments made to other people. What this has done, the anonymity of the internet has done for us, is it's sadly exposed the anger and the hatred that lives in people. And it's shown us that the only reason that a lot of people aren't saying what they intend, or they aren't saying what they really feel, they're not saying these things publicly, is because of fear of consequence. If I say that to someone's face, I'm going to get beat up. If I say it behind the guise of a username, no one knows my address, no one knows my real name, I can say whatever I want. And the anonymity has exposed the anger that lives in people's hearts. I think as Christians, while we sit here in the worship assembly, we need to ask ourselves seriously, is there someone I need to be reconciled to? As I'm coming to worship God, is there someone that I need to be reconciled to? And when we talk about reconciliation, I don't know if there is a face or a name that pops up in your head. But if there is, then let this be your encouragement to reconcile that relationship. And I say that, and I know it's more complicated than that. I don't know your specific circumstances, but I know that conflict is always more complicated than that. But Jesus teaches here the urgency of reconciliation, regardless of its complexity, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how difficult that relationship may be to restore. Jesus says there's urgency. Leave your offering at the altar and go be reconciled to your brother, and then come back and bring your worship to God. God wants your worship, but if there is a broken Christian relationship, he wants that fixed first. Let's move on to the next topic then that Jesus deals with. Topic of adultery. Verse 27, he says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery." This is a very straightforward command. Very straightforward, very easy to understand. So much so that Jesus doesn't provide a Pharisaic interpretation. He doesn't say, and by the way, this is how you were taught that this is understood. Because you look at that command, you know what it's saying. You know what it means. We know what adultery is. Adultery is a married person having an inappropriate relationship or an inappropriate sexual relationship with someone who is not their spouse. And we look at this kind of sin, and we look at it in the world today, and it's mostly condemned. But it's starting to become a little more accepted, and even in certain relationships, it's even encouraged to have this adultery. Under the Old Testament, this is a law that is punishable by death, just like murder. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10 says that both the married person as well as the person that they're having the inappropriate relationship with are both to be put to death. And we see an example of this in John chapter 8, verse 1 to 11, where Jesus confronts the Pharisees who are about to stone to death a woman who was caught in adultery. It's a law punishable by death. So, the law itself, even without the Pharisaic interpretation, it has very strict consequences. It has strict consequences. But the way Pharisees dealt with this command was to set very strict boundaries around it. They would have gender separation wherever possible. If there were a group gathered together, they would separate the women from the men. Even in the synagogue, even as they came together as an assembly to worship, they would have the women on one side and the men on the other. They'd separate it. Married women were not allowed to be alone in a room with another man. They imposed modest dress for all women. They taught that it was effectively adultery to even touch a woman's little finger. If you were to touch a woman's little finger, that was as though you were committing adultery with her. So they had these boundaries. They had these rules, and they said, you've got to be careful not to do these things. You've got to be careful with these things. They had very strict boundaries around it. I brought this up last week, but there was a group of the Pharisees who were often called the bruised Pharisees, right? And what they did was whenever they saw a woman, they would cover their eyes. And they're called bruised Pharisees because when they'd cover their eyes, they'd walk into all sorts of doors or they'd walk into walls and everything because they couldn't see where they're going. They were so concerned with adultery. There was no one stricter than the Pharisees when it came to guarding against adultery. But Jesus provides the fullness of the law in verse 28 to 30. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of the body than for your whole body to go into hell. Jesus is not referring here to a glance, or Jesus is not referring here to, like the bruised Pharisees would say, that whenever you see a woman, you need to cover your eyes. He's not dealing with a glance. He's not even dealing with physical attraction. He's not dealing with recognizing that a woman might be physically attractive. The ESV translates it well, I think. The ESV uses the word lustful intent, that there's desire being brought out in this. This is gazing at a woman with sinful thoughts. This is dealing with specifically wanting to or even planning to engage in adultery. To give it one of those thoughts, we might look at this as if a man looks at a woman and says, well, if I weren't married, then these are the things I'd do. This is what I'd pursue if I wasn't married. And again, you might think, well, I'd never actually do that, but, just thinking through the possibilities, if I weren't married, the hypotheticals. Jesus says that's a sin. That's as though you're committing adultery with this woman. He's dealing with a guilty heart and not just guilty actions. As mentioned, the world today seems to be on a trajectory of sympathy toward adultery. It seems to be interested in, if not encouraging, at least accepting that people are going to commit adultery. And, maybe that's the right thing for them in their relationship. I recall reading an article. I didn't read the article. I read the title and I didn't want to read the article. I read the title of the article and it was how cheating on my husband made me a better mother. That's the world we live in today. That's the attitude towards adultery. I think, we look at that trajectory, we see sympathy toward adultery, but even more than that, we see a world that has already given itself over to this lustful intent. It is drenched with lustful intent. We think of advertising, how it uses women to cause lustful intent in men to sell products. Or even if if you're using YouTube, often if they have like a movie clip, they're going to pick a certain clip to have as the thumbnail for that movie clip. They're always going to pick that scene that has the half-dressed woman in it. Or they're always going to choose that section that is going to make the most men click on this image. People promote the use of pornography, even for boys at a very young age. That it's something that they should do to let out their adolescent frustration. This is how many are raising their sons to look at women. Many people today are raising their sons to look at women with lustful intent. That's the way that that people are viewing, that young men are being raised to look at women. It's even the way that many are raising their daughters to find affection. You need to create lustful intent in males. That's the way you're going to get boys to look at you. That's the way you're going to get men to look at you, to give you affection and to give you attention. Produce lust in them. As Christians, we need to be separate from this. We need to get away from this as far as we can. We need to raise our sons to treat women with respect and not sexual objects for their viewing. Fathers, we need to think about the way we talk to our wife in front of our children. Probably more importantly, we need to think about the way we talk about other women in front of our children. As men, we need to guard our own hearts so that we don't fall into this trap. We think of the statistics. The number of preachers in the Lord's church who have fallen into adultery is staggering. It is a staggering statistic. I don't know exactly the number of the church, and I don't even want to know what that number is. I remember my instructor in one of his classes, he says, for every class I've had, for every class I've taught, there has been one student who falls into sexual sin. That's the statistic. That is not to say that every single class has had one person, but for every class he's taught, there is a corresponding number of people who have fallen into sexual sin from those classes. The number of people who struggle with adultery of the heart is even higher than the number of people who fall into adultery. We can look at it as the Pharisees do and say, well, yeah, I think we do this, and I think there's some degree of application to this. And we look at what the Pharisees say, and when we look at people who have fallen into sexual sin, when we say, well, they shouldn't have been alone, they shouldn't have dressed immodestly, they shouldn't have done all these things. And, well, that's probably good advice. And I 100% agree that's good advice. It's not the problem. It's not the problem. The problem is that there was lustful intent. Adultery doesn't happen by accident. Some people say things when they're committed of this, and they say, I don't know what happened. I don't know how this happened. There are steps that take place towards adultery. There are things that you do, compromises that you make along the way that lead into adultery. But the very start of it, the very problem with adultery is lustful intent. This desire, this intention that begins in the heart. The problem that we need to address is guarding ourselves against lustful intent. If this lesson was about murder and adultery, if this lesson was merely about those things, just about the sins of murder and adultery, we could all leave this room feeling justified, saying, I've ticked that box, haven't killed anyone this week. But Jesus teaches that there is much more to these laws than just a box that we can tick. He teaches that the visible act forbidden by the law is only the outward expression of an inward desire. God is not merely concerned with our outward obedience, but he's concerned with our inward purity. He doesn't want people who can say, look at me, I haven't killed anyone. Look at me, I haven't cheated on my wife. He wants people with pure and clean hearts. And if we're honest with ourselves and we look at our own hearts, we don't see purity always. We don't see cleanliness in our own hearts. If we examine our own hearts, we can't so confidently justify ourselves from the sins of murder and adultery. But maybe it's not anger or lust that's an issue for him. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's retaliation. Maybe it's loving your enemy. Maybe it's one of the other things that we'll cover over the next 3 weeks. And if you can't think of anything that your heart has a problem with, then it's pride or self-deception. Whatever it is, our hearts are impure. We haven't kept this standard of the law. We haven't kept the fullness of the law. What we need is a new heart and a clean heart, free from these desires. And this is precisely what Christ has promised to give those who trust in him. We could instead, like the Pharisees, try to come up with plans to avoid our sinful desires, but the only real fix is a new and a clean heart through Christ. Let's be upstanding as we sing the final song.